Negotiating Reality. I'm your host, Eric Heckler. Today's guest is Saeed Dawlabani, a human evolution theorist and a leading thinker on cultural evolution. And you'll see we talked a lot about that in today's one. So, Saeed's journey is exemplified in the work he's told here. So, 25 years ago, he said about he was a successful real estate developer and investment advisor, and by his own description, quote, master of his own universe and living the American dream. Then, a divorce cracked that dream, and it started to open up bigger questions for him about purpose and meaning. And then he met his now late wife, unfortunately, Elza, who was a human rights attorney and activist for Middle East peace. And Saeed and Elza, through a connection via Elza as being really the connector here of all of this, met Don Beck, who is a key developer of the model spiral dynamics. For those of you who are not familiar with spiral dynamics, Don Beck, building on the work of Claire Graves, who is a psychologist and contemporary of Maslow, took the initial ideas and working of Claire Graves and tried to simplify it and make it more accessible by the notion of spiral dynamics. He then applied this a model and approach to try to contribute towards the movements and work happening in South Africa, particularly during the transition from apartheid. So, Saeed became Beck's close associate, and working closely with Elza, they founded the Center for Human Emergence Middle East. And what they were really doing was applying this framework to try to work on the intractable problem, particularly between peace between Palestine and Israel, which we talk a little bit about here, although that was a whole rich one that honestly would have I wanted to get in more, but we didn't too. So with that a little bit about background, Saeed's first book, Memenomics, was published in 2013, was really all about taking this kind of cultural, evolutional, and developmental lens to our financial systems and economics, particularly right after the financial crisis, right? And really just saying how all the unhealthy expressions, which he kind of framed as only money matters, really was creating huge problems for us. But that's actually not what we're talking about. It's brilliant, it's cool, it's interesting, it comes in. But what we really talked about was this book, Second Sapiens, The Rise of the Planetary Mind and the Future of Humanity. In it, Saeed did something really bold. He basically, in part invited by Don Beck, was invited to kind of reimagine the entire spiral dynamics framework, particularly from the lens of how do you think about this model when you start to recognize the moment we're in now, in this planetary collapse moment, right? That was the key thing, right? What sort of intelligence is required when you're living in a moment when 7 of the 9 planetary boundaries have been crossed? And his answer became a fundamental reorientation in my mind, and as I think he saw it, in the model, right? And he kind of labeled it this idea of Promethean intelligence as sort of all the stuff of what he calls first sapiens, human ingenuity and our capacity to do science and technology and whatnot, to second sapiens intelligence, which is really grounded in Gaian intelligence, or the wisdom of Earth and her living systems. So this conversation goes deep into that framework, and we go deep and wide. We keep playing and exploring and looking at it from different angles. And so for anyone who has an interest in kind of spiral dynamics and otherwise, particularly using it as a lens to understand cultural evolution, this is the place for you to play with. Beyond that, if you're someone who senses that our current system is reaching their limits, if you're drawn to developmental frameworks, but you're wondering how to apply them into this existential moment, or if you're looking for a map that honors both human potential and planetary boundaries, this conversation is for you. With that, I do want to honor this is a rich, crazy, complex conversation. So there's a lot of layers and levels to it. This is the longest episode I've made, and probably, I don't know if I will make ones longer than this. And I also get into a long reflection after this because there's just so much here. But honestly, I think to properly respect just the rich wisdom and all the great insights that Saeed is bringing to us, I think it just takes the time. So rather than cutting it down, I just wanted you to hear the whole thing. So if this is getting long and you need to pause, great, go for it. Come in, do it in chunks and whatnot. But I really think there's something here to kind of sit with this whole perspective. With that, let's dive in. All right, Saeed, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for the opportunity, Eric. Glad to be with you.
Cool. Yeah, so let's get started with, I want to actually start with sort of like what I picked up as almost feeling like a catch-22 when I was reading your book. You know, it's like it seemed like there was this central puzzle, and honestly, just to name it, I've been picking it up too, right? It's just this sense that we're kind of in a bind, right? Like it seems like we're all. I think there's a general sense of like there's things that are collapsing, and we need to reboot and re-update, right? This is the actually the last conversation I had with Matt Bigger in this space, right? Um, there's something fundamentally wrong, right? We need to update our economic systems and our social systems, and yet it seems like we're stuck in this bind where we basically need a level of developmental maturity, coordination, and communication capacity that basically isn't here, right? It's like we're not ready. And actually, the people that have, I love your CAPI phrase, right? This idea that the coalition of authority and power and influence, basically, the folks that have that, they're not ready to do this and they actively undermine this,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And so it feels like we're in a catch-22. And so that I just wanted to start with like that seems to be the issue. And I wanted to offer that as a frame, but then I wanted to invite you to kind of restate it and otherwise and like help us to just sort of like describe the challenge that we seem to be in as for humanity.
Absolutely. Thank you for phrasing it in those terms, Eric. But it's really, let me just preface this by saying it might be a catch-22 for you and me and maybe less than 5% of the world's population out there. We seem to be in touch with emerging problems that need to be addressed, but 95% of the world does not see a catch-22. Specifically what you mentioned to me as a meta meme that caught your eye that I use in the book called Peace Through Commerce. 80 years ago, when that paradigm was created and came to existence, it represented the leading edge of intelligence at the time.
Mm,
Everybody subscribed to the idea that peace through commerce is the way forward as we left our savage, war, bloody history behind and embraced a new way for approaching peace. It wasn't, bilateral agreements through just being nice people. There was a motivation that says, you're invited to be a part of this global new dynamic that says you can achieve peace through development, through modernization, through engaging in reforming your economy and make it into a market economy. And the byproduct of that is peace. Now, what has happened is, and this speaks directly to the one of the models that I introduce in my book about ideological life cycles. So
yes.
this is a mega ideology that was born, at the end of World War II. And it was at the time that it was born, it was the cutting edge of thinking. It was the leading edge global leaders, the leading economists, the leading thinkers in the world that developed that platform. And it sort of the entire world assimilated into it. And
Mm,
so as an ideology reaches the point of maturity, and we keep using tools from within that ideology, it becomes the marginal benefit from it becomes more and more reduced. Now, we're at a stage where peace through commerce has taken the entire world by storm. And so the bigger and the more nations and groups that the ideology brings into that paradigm, the more difficult it's going to be to address it. And so,
mm,
what would have been ideal and leading edge of social evolution 80 years ago is now becoming a problem. So, once a system moves past that maturity stage, it begins to create cracks in the thinking that created it. And when that begins to happen, it's calling on higher stages of intelligence to step in and begin to figure out problems. So really, this speaks to the evolutionary nature of the model and life cycles of ideologies and stages of development for that matter. So what might be a catch-22 for you, me, and maybe 5% of the world's population might not be so for the rest of the world because they're just, there are countries now. I mean, the UN still advocates for development. The UN still advocates for modernization, and it is the current paradigm that we have towards modernization and development that is affecting the planetary systems that are in one state or another of collapse. So the challenge is really how do you create the new leadership from that higher level of thinking that understands what's going on in the world And you already spoke about it. And who holds the power to bring this to our institutions and global leadership?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is, yeah, let me think about that. Who really holds power? Because this is an issue that requires, uh, uh, if not the halting of what we have taken for granted as what's good and just for the last 100 years or so, if not halting it, reversing it. And so it not just a matter of, sitting back and assessing where we are and slowing down. The whole issue of whether the systems that are in collapse that are human built or the natural systems that are in collapse. The argument that I make in my book is that the values of the future have to be oriented towards degrowth, which
Hmm.
flies in the face of what our economic system is all about now. It's
Right.
grow or die. Well, we're now coming into the area where those values are pressing up against the existing system, and the new system is saying, you grow and you will die. The earth has a finite number of resources.
Right.
The ideas that made democracy so popular, the ideas that have spread peace through commerce, have their limits, and there needs to be a higher form of intelligence that solves these problems that we are struggling with. So that is the framing. I wish I had the answer, Eric, to
Sure.
what's next, but
Yeah.
but these are complex dynamics. It's the bigger the system that you have to address, the more complexity there is in it, and the more variables, the more combinatorials have to be factored in, and unfortunately, it would have to be a significant breakdown in what we have taken for granted that triggers people to say, yeah, we're going to listen to those smart guys and see what they have to say.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, there's so much richness in that, and then and basically that's what we're going to be talking about. So, like you hitting the developmental issues, you're hitting the issues of sort of like just some people being able to see things. You're very clearly bringing in a systems perspective and a systems thinking capacity, right? And then a combinatory. I particularly love the evolutionary. Like it sounds like central to your orientation is this real critical important, and I write it in the book of course too, right? Central in your book of thinking in evolutionary terms, right? And how like almost like the sort of like the solutions of the past, like you were honoring, it was great, the solutions of the past were solving a problem of the past, but now they are basically the problems that we are now facing, right? And knowing that there's that sort of need for healthy growth and maturation and that cycles that include death of these, particularly these memes. So I love it so much. Yeah, I love that you just set up so much for us to unpack together. If I may, just uh, before we get into all that, I want to now just go back and honestly just invite you into a bit of this sort of like, tell us a bit about you and your background, particularly, you were really getting like all the, your, a bit of your personal story of like, how did you come into this work and what drew you particularly into spiral dynamics, which we're going to have you kind of define a little bit. If you want, you can give that a bit now. And just a little bit of your sense of like how you grew into sort of that awareness, that you were just starting to show up a bit on. So.
Eric, 26 years ago, I was happy building homes and being an investment advisor in real estate, and life was wonderful living in that fifth stage of development where, I was the master of my own universe and nothing bothered me. And I went through my first divorce, and so, that sort of like, made me question, the purpose of the American dream and, looking beyond what wealth and the pursuit of a good life is all about. And, a few years into that inquiry, I met my late wife, Elsa Malouf, who was more into humanitarian aspects. She was a human rights attorney uh, who sort of began by researching. She's from Lebanon. We're both from Lebanon, and so she knew what less developed places around the world differ from what we take for granted here in the States. And being the hyper intellectual that she would read a book a week. And one of those books that she read was Ken Wilber's A Theory of Everything,
Hmm.
in which she discovered most of his reference are to Don Beck and spiral dynamics. And to her, wanting to, and she was always an activist for the Palestinian cause. She's always thought peace between Israel and Palestine and what that meant to the overall region. And so she looked up Don Beck, basically. She bought his book, Spiral Dynamics, read through it, and then did some research on, what other things he's written. And lo and behold, she runs into a paper that he wrote about why peace in the Middle East hasn't taken root. And so she analyzes that paper and makes notes in the margins and contacts Dr. Beck and says, "Here's what I think you need help. You can't just dismiss the idea that Sharia law is out the window. You have to, that's what these, things that only a someone who knows the culture would know." And within days, he called her and says, "I have a training in Boulder in 2 weeks. Can you come?" And she said, "Absolutely."
Wow.
And at that training that he asked her, and for a little bit more background about Don Beck, Don was involved in helping South Africa transition from apartheid in the late 80s and 90s.
Oh, wow.
It was from that experience that he really finalized the details and the vetting of what the theory was all about. And so when he wrote Spiral Dynamics in 98, it was primarily through his applications of the theory in South Africa. So after 9/11, he was looking to do the same things that he did in South Africa in the Middle East. And lo and behold, that's when, Alza discovered him. And so they both conspired to get me involved and to do work with them. And that's how we started the Center for Human Emergence Middle East, where the three of us started doing work on the issue of peace in the Middle East. That's how I was brought into the model. But at the same time, I was still, in that transition phase of my life, shifting away from being, in the real estate business to really seeing, a higher possibility of really what it means to cater to humanity, and having been blessed with the opportunity that I have, I felt like it was time for me to start, paying it back somehow.
Hmm.
And so we worked on the Middle East issue for a few years, and then I really didn't come into fully understanding spiral dynamics till around 2006. I understood its applications for, geopolitics and so forth, and especially with the Middle East. But around 2006, we saw the initial phases of the financial crisis that started with the housing market.
Mm.
Well, I studied economics and finance in college, and I've been in the business for so long.
Yeah.
And so I began to write articles about, what the causes of the financial crisis were through the spectrum of spiral dynamics. And I
Mm.
began to make presentations about it with Don and Elza, at training seminars that we held. And one day Don Beck says, "Well, unless you're building homes and making a lot of losses, you should sit down and write a book."
Uh,
And so, that culminated in my 2013 book, Memenomics, the Next Generation Economic System. So that's how I came into the system, into really adopting this model as a theory that explains everything. It doesn't explain everything, but it explains quite a bit.
mm.
And once you allow yourself to absorb it and understand its different dimensions, it really becomes an important instrument to use to navigate life, to really be able to give advice to alternative solutions when that advice is sought. So that's how I came into spiral dynamics.
Oh, that's great. What a great story. And now I would love to kind of unpack both aspects of that. So first, the just tell us a bit more for those who have no background in spiral dynamics. Just give us the basic foundation, and then after that, we can follow up with. Then I'd love to hear how you used it in practice. But let's start with just the basics of what is this theory, this framework.
Yeah, so this is a complex theory.
Yeah.
Usually a week of training for the average person to get to understand the theory. So I'm going to try to unpack it in 5 to 7 minutes if I can. So spiral dynamics is basically a development model that is hierarchical in nature, meaning that once we solve the challenges of our life, we begin to create the life conditions for us to exist at a higher stage of development. And that's how the movement, that is really an essential part of how the model works, is that you solve certain problems of existence and you elevate yourself to another stage of existence, which has its own unique set of problems, requiring higher neurological activation in the brain that allows you to live at that level. And that's how, we talked about life cycles. That's how, when that stage reaches its maturity and you can't tap into the intelligence of that stage, it calls on the, next stages form of intelligence to be triggered. And that's how you move up the hierarchical spiral, if you will. The important thing about this, Eric, is that the model is not only based in psychology. So it's for personal growth. It is for organizational consulting and growth. It is used, for to solve, macro issues, geopolitics. I've applied it successfully to address issues of, global finance and economics and so forth. So it applies equally to societies as much as it applies to the individual. But the basic tenet of the model is that over the last 50, 60 years or so, we had uncovered a total of 8 stages of development that humanity has gone through. And this is an open-ended model, meaning that as our problems of existence complexify, they call on higher intelligence within our brains to be activated. And it's the way the founder of the model described it, it's a never-ending quest. So in a sense, our species is one biological entity that existed, but we are an infinite number of psychological beings that are still evolving. And so basically, if is it okay to just give a brief description of every
Yeah.
stage?
Yeah, I think it'll
So
be good. I think it's important for the rest of the conversation, right?
right,
So working with your
okay,
framework. So yeah, please.
yeah. So
Oh, actually, maybe
I,
just
I
note
just
it. Something to note. I think I wanted you and I both talked about this beforehand. Is like I think we're both really anchoring in this conversation towards using it for understanding cultural evolution,
right,
right?
right,
And so it's like anchoring that we're not really going to get into the individual aspects. I think there's a lot of interesting conversation there, but that's not the orientation. We're really trying to think like the center of gravity of a culture, which I think particularly Said used nicely. Like at least I understand it, like using those notions of memes as a way of kind of helping to see in our characters.
right.
But yeah, yeah. But anyway, please go into that
Well,
orientation. But I wanted to make everyone know we're thinking about this in this conversation about cultural evolution and the development. Please.
Well, you're speaking to the right person, my friend, because there are hundreds of thousands of people certified in spiral dynamics. 95% use them for personal growth and organizational consulting. There's really, a few dozen people around the world who use it for, cultural evolution, for societal, for addressing societal ills. And, and that's been my experience. That's really what attracted me to it. I really wasn't, there's so many psychological models that address personal growth. I don't use spiral dynamics for that. So basically, yeah, the model as I use it applies to societal development. And it basically, the first stage of development is called the survivalistic stage. This is when we were hunter-gatherers going back 200, 300,000 years ago, when we lived in fear of nature, crawling into caves for shelter, being afraid of the beasts and, the power of Mother Nature and so forth. And we lived like that till about 40,000 years ago. And then as that stage of development reached its maturity stage and began to call on higher intelligence, we began to learn how to cooperate with each other. The caveman decided to team up with other cavemen in order to, to kill the beast and be able to survive. We decided to cooperate with other Homo sapiens to harness the land, and so that became a part of the development of the next stage of development, which is the tribalistic existence. The tribe wants to live in safety and harmony, and as a organizational structure for that, you have the typical formation of the tribe. You have the tribal leader, you have the chief, you have the medicine man, you have the spiritual guide, and so forth. And so you live in that state of existence, and these are historic as well as contemporary, Eric. You still have a lot of tribal existence around the world. Most of the Middle East is in that state of tribal existence. Although they have money and modernity, their virtues and what motivates culture the most are still tribalistic values. I mean, they're beautiful tribalistic values that the West has sort of like sidelined, but they're used, they're tapped into as a tool to navigate reality today. And so once that stage reaches its maturity stage and begins to create a crack in the system, it calls on intelligence of higher order. And so you get a few wise men in the tribe that says, hey, I am a strong man. The chief is not always right. So, you get a couple of big strapping men pound their chest and say, hey, I'm moving on to the next stage. And the next stage is identified by egocentric virtues. It is the first stage of existence that where you begin to see the human ego in its raw form.
Mm,
This is the stage where you act impulsively, you act without any guilt. It really is one of the more dangerous stages that an individual or a culture can go through.
mm,
It acts punitively. It's a very bloody stage of existence. At the macro scale, it identifies with empires and dictators. And today, I would say about half of the world or more is still centered in those stages of development, and they assimilate higher stages into how they act, but at their core, they're still centered in those stages.
mm,
And so uh, our current leadership here in the state is centered around the values of egocentrism. After me, the deluge. That's the meme for that.
mm,
Only I can fix it. That is
mhm,
that
mhm.
meme. And we've
There it
heard
is.
Donald Trump say that several times. So, if the expression of only I can fix it, it comes from a healthy intent. So each stage of development has a healthy and unhealthy
Yeah.
expression of it. If you come from the healthy expression, it is probably good for the culture. And specifically with, what like, the MAGA movement and Trump is doing. If they weren't so intent on destroying institutions, that value system, that third stage of development, normally acts as a cleansing agent for the
Mm,
entire stack of the spiral when it becomes arrested, when it just, movement doesn't happen. You're stuck at a state where no new solutions are coming, no new ideas are coming in, and that's when a third stage leader comes in and cleanses the spiral. Except, we seem to be using an axe instead of a scalpel to do so. And so, as that fourth stage reaches its maturity and it begins to tap against, the next stage of intelligence, which is stage four. And by the way, as we jump into each stage, the new stage spends a considerable amount of time fixing what went wrong with the stage before. In a sense, if you look at this historically, uh, you know, it was because of the Spanish Inquisition that we got the Reformation movement. It was because of the plagues and the Dark Ages that we got the scientific revolution. So in a sense, it provides answers to what we couldn't achieve, under the other stage of development. And the Spanish Inquisition falls into that fourth stage of development, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But that's the nature of how the model moves. So as we ascend into the fourth stage, it looks to fix what went wrong before. Instead of being guilt-free and doing what comes into your mind without restriction, with punitive intent, the fourth system comes in and says, oh no, there has to be temperance. There has to be values that postpone the idea of immediate gratification. And so the answer to that came first in the form of the Abrahamic religions, is
mm,
that, if you develop a saintly existence where you postpone your gratifications now for rewards later that might come in life or, even afterwards in heaven, it is a good, it's a good way to be as a human being.
mhm,
And so stage four is primarily what Dr. Graves, the founder of the model, called the absolutistic stage of existence. It's very dualistic. It has, it's either black or white. There's no gray areas in between. Um, very sharp elbows in the sense that, we all respect the law. You either respect the law or you don't. It's and so as we and at the macro scale, Eric, this is the stage where democracy begins. This is where we lay the foundation for for institutions.
Hmm.
So it is a matter of power transitioning from the hands of the egocentric, often male uh, person in the third stage to vesting power in the institutions of a society.
Hmm.
Very critical stage. The Middle East and other parts of the world are still struggling in that transition from stage four to stage five. From stage three to stage four. And so as you live at that stage, and this is a model that transcends and includes in the sense that you transcend the stage that you went through, but you include it in your mosaic of values. You include it in the totality of who you are. But the preference is to include the healthy expressions of those values. So we bring with us, as we transition from stage four to stage five, we bring with us the values that we created that established institutions. And so we build on that. Okay.
Yes.
So that stage to a lot of people becomes very punitive. It's very conformist. It's sharp elbows. But promotion in society is strictly based on seniority and your rank in society. You go to church, you get promoted. You obey the rules.
Yes.
And so some smart people, as that stage reaches maturity, think, hey, I can't live in this restrictive, conformative lifestyle. I am smart. I'm able to create my own rational thought, and those are the people who begin to create the thinking for stage five. Now, stage five is a stage of multiplistic ways of thinking. So it's not absolutistic black and white anymore. It offers you a variety of solutions that you engage in. The driving force behind stage five is the idea that we as a species seek to uncover the secrets of the universe
Hmm.
through scientific research, research and development, through, algorithmic and mathematical modeling. In a sense, we moved away from an outer God that sees us and we have to obey to us being God, to us beginning to provide answers to so many of our problems. Well, the very nature of that system is that it's very strategic in its thinking. It's also very manipulative. So
Hmm.
it manipulates in order for it to advance and become successful. And
Hmm.
this is really where the West is centered. It's
Hmm.
healthy expressions gave us what we have here in La Jolla. It gave us the biomedical community, the research and development. But its unhealthy expression gave us Wall Street that caused a financial crisis in 2008. So
Yeah.
that's just an example of the two different sides of the same psychosocial system that proprietary to stage five. So as we move closer to the maturity phase, the individual in that system looks around and says, is this all there is to life? Almost, exactly what I went through,
Yeah.
after experiencing financial success, and you look around and your kids don't talk to you, your friends, because you begin to question the purpose of friendships for whatever reasons. You look around and say, is this all there is to life? And that's when you begin to create the life conditions that will trigger that higher level of intelligence that gets you into stage six. Stage six, again, looks to fix what was wrong with stage five, the unhealthy aspect of it, but is really centered about humanistic values. It is centered about egalitarianism, is centered around being part of community, egalitarianism, altruistic values that say, hey, we are all the same. Well, forget about this idea that there's a hierarchy that defines who we are and what our roles are in society. And the best example, the best macro example of what a green structure of leadership is, what Western European countries stand for. Their at least their economic policies are based in great part on that system that says, regardless of what your income is, you're going to get free healthcare. Regardless of what your income is, your university is for free and it's the best education in the world. Those are the virtues of that system. But that system also has its unhealthy side. And the biggest uh, the biggest fault in it is that because it doesn't see hierarchy, it invites individuals like from stage three to sit at the round table and share in discussions, and it believes that, oh, poor Genghis Khan, if he only had a chance to express himself, we'll all get along. Well, Genghis Khan, Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin will happily take part of that discussion, and they laugh at you in your face, and they turn around and dominate, whatever. I mean, that's why so much of, the policies of the UN, which is designed from that six-level system, don't work. They don't have enforcement mechanisms because we really don't want to be punitive towards anyone in culture. We're all equal. And so what I've described so far, Eric, represents the first tier of values, so the six
Yeah.
stages, which in my book I refer to as the values of first sapiens. And Graves, the Dr. Graves, who created the original model, called them the values of the subsistent humanity, meaning that we haven't reached our full potential in those stages of development. It's our motivations are subsistent in a sense that they're proprietary to each stage of existence. Someone in the fifth stage looks down at everyone else as like, yeah, I don't want to be a part of that. I've transcended that. But yet they don't understand that their next stage of evolution is the stage of becoming humanitarian and becoming a human again before you transition to higher stages. So that's where we're stuck. That's where much of the solutions that were being offered don't take root. It's because that green system in spiral dynamics, what I call Sapien 1.6, is preoccupied with making sure that everybody gets along, dismisses the notion that it really has to understand the motivation of people who run our economy who are in the fifth stage of development. They're just too angry at it. When what you need is someone who really understands how the global economy got to be where it is, how the dysfunction in leadership got to where it is, and begin to address it forensically. They're just, too preoccupied with let's just sit, hold hands, and things will be fine. That is the primary reason why things haven't moved to, what we'd consider effective, global whole system solution. And so this is the first tier. Now, so I mentioned 8 stages of development. The last two stages, stage 7 and 8, belong in the second tier, which is Second Sapiens. So
Yeah.
stage 7, basically, that's when, as a humanity, according to Dr. Graves' research, our psychosocial capacities grow exponentially. The ability of a person who thinks in the seventh level system uh, are way bigger than the entire first tier of thinking put together. They come up with solutions that are a lot more efficient, that are cost effective, and take less than half of the time to come up with solutions. This is a human being who is fully realize and understanding the motivation of all the 6 systems below them. And they can go into each system and say, hey, here's where you're stuck, I'll fix this. Here's where you're stuck, I'll fix that. And so someone who thinks in 7 stage manner, understand the motivation of the entire lower system and begins to design whole systems that make those lower systems beholden to a higher, healthier image of themselves. And so that's one part of what the seventh system does. The second part is that it looks at what the eighth system is all about. And, they're highly collaborative because you use full brain capacities, whole brain capacities to come up with solutions. So it looks at the eighth system is asking us to do and puts all the lower systems towards a trajectory towards what we need to achieve, in the eighth stage, which, today is really about the stabilization of all life on the planet.
Mhm.
And so once level 7 stabilizes the conditions of life in all the lower systems, it basically hands it over to the eighth system and says, here you go, now time for you to do your magic in making sure that all life on Earth survives. So basically, Don Beck uses the beautiful example of how the seventh and eighth stage act. The seventh level is the surgeon who stitches together a wounded world, and the eighth stage is the long-term a caretaker who puts the ointment on that wound to make sure that the patient survives in the long term. So this is, I might have taken a little more than
All
7 or 8
good.
minutes to explain this, but this is pretty much a summary of the model. And if you engage in it, if you use it for as long as I have, it's almost inevitable that most of the you begin to think that most of the solutions to our problems must come from one of those stages, must come from, I mean, the most important stage at this stage of development is stage 7, because you have to know what went wrong in the lower stages in order to fix them before we begin to plan on, what a utopian place in an ecologically aligned planet looks like, which is the primary motivation of the eighth stage of development. So that's a summary of spiral dynamics. I hope it was clear.
I thought it was. It was great. I also read the book, and now we're getting into your book, which is fantastic. So, Second Sapiens is a key thing we're getting into, but I really just wanted everyone to kind of hear just the richness and depth of Said's knowledge and wisdom in this, both theoretically and then briefly. The last thing before we get into your book, I just wanted you to connect that back to the Middle East for a sec. Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
maybe we can be a little more brief here, but just like give us like
yeah,
like you
yeah.
have a lot of practical experience of like how you didn't just think about this theoretically, you were using it very practically to work on
Right,
really
right.
intractable problems. So just tell us a little bit about that, and then we'll move into the Second Sapiens book.
Yeah, yeah. I promise to keep it under 5. So our engagement in the Middle East was basically, we were asked by some, young Israeli men who were really into wanting to find a solution for the issue in the Middle East. And they basically were the people who ran the Integral Salon in Tel Aviv. They invited Don Beck to come and do what he did in South Africa between Israel and Palestine. And Don Beck says, I can only do it if Elza, who knows the local culture, who knows the laws of the Middle East, Sharia law. In Lebanon we had the Napoleon Code, and she's also familiar with common law and so forth. And that was the initial invitation. They went over there knowing that the approach to peace is going to be completely different than what we considered peace is supposed to be. You get the Oslo Accords, you get the 7 or 8 different peace treaties that fell apart, and so we began to address why that happens. And so on our first 2 years of the mission, and we were there for a good 10 years, first 2 years of the mission, what we did is we did a social assessment of stages of development of each culture. So we basically trained a group of Israeli integral thinkers into the model, and we basically told them, go out to society at large and tell us what stages of development are the most prominent in Israel. And we did the same thing with the Palestinians. Told them, go out there and tell us what you think. Ask questions. Assess, the model, assess what the culture of development, what the stages of cultural development is. And what the Israelis came back with is the idea that, Israel, for better or worse, is a development-prone country. Its mimetic stack, if you will, its value system stack is more comparable to the West. It is realized in, the fourth stage system, which honors institutions. It is realized in the fifth stage, which engages in scientific discovery and innovation. Israel, produces more of the high-tech innovation than most of the rest of the world, except for the United States and maybe China now. But and they're also realized in the sixth stage that says, hey, we really need to live peaceful coexistence with our neighbors. And so that was the profile of the Israeli side. And then our Palestinian partners came back, and their findings was the Palestinian territories are not that much different than the rest of the Middle East. They are stuck in level 2 in tribalistic values. Uh, and the next sequence of development is for them to express themselves through the third stage of development. The heroic, the egocentric, the bloody, I need my own country for independence. I will fight through, militias or whatever to make my voice heard before I can get to that stage, fourth stage of development where we begin to build institutions. So our thinking shifted away from, creating peace between Israel and Palestine to we renamed our mission to the Build Palestine initiative. In a sense, we told the Israelis, you're fine on your own. We need to level the social development asymmetry that exists between the two countries. You're up here, your center of gravity is up here, the Palestinians are down here. They need to build institutions. They need to, number one, address issues of corruption, address, leadership issues where someone speaks in one voice for what a Palestinian nation looks like. You need to stem a lot of the graft that was in the system, the people who started, the PLO and all these other organizations were lining their pockets with money from whatever comes in from the United Nations. It was very third level exploitation of the Palestinian people. So we shifted the focus on teaching them how to address issues of corruption, how to build institutions. So at least that asymmetry levels up a bit. So when you sit down at the negotiation tables, the Palestinians can say, yeah, we can sign an accord with you now because we have institutions. We have developed into the fourth stage of development. The minimum stage of development determines what a modern nation is all about. So that was really the driving force behind our work there. Unfortunately, we were being funded completely by benevolent people. No State Department money or anything like that. And by the time the economic crisis 2008 came along, all the funding sources dried up. We stayed at a consulting capacity with our Palestinian partners, but then, both the Palestinians and the Israelis sort of moved away from that so important political center where deals happen, and the whole thing, I don't want to say fell apart. We still get calls occasionally from people to, hey, you're going to come out and train us again in spiral dynamics, and the dynamics on the ground now does not allow for something like that to be fruitful.
Yeah, and I would imagine that's a whole deep, rich, of course, conversation is going on right now. And so, and just noting at the time that you were doing that, right? There was early 2000s and otherwise, right? And now we're in a very different place in time. I could imagine that some of those assessments might have shifted, both in Israel and otherwise, right? And but maybe that would be a deep conversation. Maybe we can have it another time. But just kind of holding that of just like noticing the space and time of that, and really just kind of honoring that you are really putting your sort of money when your mouth is, of like really trying to do the work of helping us all grow and mature, right? I'm grateful for you to like trying that effort, right? So with that, let's get into the book.
Yeah,
So fantastic book. I loved reading it, Second Sapiens. I want to just start a little bit first with just the opening of it, right? So you start the book with Prometheus and particularly that gift of fire, right? And I want to invite everyone, you chose that as a starting point.
right.
I just wanted to invite you to kind of like describe it and describe a little bit about why you chose that particular metaphor as a foundation for helping us
Yeah.
think about Second Sapiens.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I wanted to, I was looking to restate what needs to be done from the largest possible holonic structure that contains a lot more than what is known to us. So I really needed to frame the initial subject of the book in things such as mythology, such as spirituality, just to give gravity to the idea that what we're facing is of historic proportions. So even before I introduced Prometheus into the discussion, I begin to talk about, when the universe came into existence. Call it the Big Bang Theory, call it creation, whatever you preference into how the universe came into existence. And when it did, it created this thing we call pair of opposites. Pair
Mm.
of opposites basically says that, when time was created, things were divided into pair of opposites that are constantly in balance, that they need to, you need to see both sides of the pair of opposites in order for you to have a reasonably healthy view of how things work. I mean, it's the pair of opposites are darkness and light, evil and good. You know,
Breathing in,
it's
breathing out,
yeah,
contraction, expansion,
no,
right?
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I mean, It's, it's but the importance of it is really summarized in Newton's, what is it, second law of
Thermodynamics.
motion. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. For
emotion.
every
Yeah.
action, there's an opposite and equal reaction. Well, because we're so centered in the fifth stage of development, which is very, manipulative and does so in a scientific way, we sort of forgotten the reaction. I mean, to me, this is really critical. We seem to embrace the good in humanity and externalizing the bad, externalizing the idea that every action has an opposite and equal reaction. We have to know what that opposite reaction is in order for our views to be whole. And if we don't do that, and we ignore the dark side of our action, it becomes part of our shadow.
Yeah.
And so, and the more we ignore, the more that shadow grows and becomes more complex and more violent or effective when it breaks. But really, I wanted to frame it in no sense that we are, that's our dualistic nature. We always have to hold these pair of opposites. And the introduction to Prometheus, well, the story of Prometheus is from Greek myth. The name Prometheus is the one with forethought. And forethought is very unique to our species. So, in a sense, he symbolizes a human ingenuity, the genius that birthed us. And as far as the myth goes, Prometheus is known for stealing fire from Mount Olympus and giving it to humanity in the form of art, science, modernity, technology, and so forth. And for him doing so, he was punished by Zeus and tied to a rock. And an eagle every night will come and eat his liver, and the liver would regenerate overnight, representing the genius of our species. But what the way we've taken on that Promethean intelligence is through that fifth stage of development
Yeah.
that takes the best expression of who we are in technology, in the innovation, in the scientific process. The scientific method itself could easily fall into the cracks if we don't consider the opposite reaction of what we're doing. And so, in a sense, it paints the frailness of who we are when we don't consider the consequences of our actions. To pair that and compare it to other forms of intelligence, I compare Prometheus with Gaia, which is another goddess that came into existence far earlier than Prometheus. Gaia represents, the energy that created the earth, the water, the ground, and the air. And her intelligence is completely different than Promethean intelligence, which identifies with the human intelligence. And really, that's the basic argument in the book, is that we need to return to understanding how Gaian intelligence works, natural intelligence, the thing that brought life into existence 3.5 billion years ago, not just 300,000 years ago when our species came into prominence. So that's the Promethean myth.
I love that, and I love how what you're hitting on is sort of inviting us as through metaphor of using both Prometheus and Gaia as a foundation. It's basically, it sounds like what you're getting at is sort of very much the sort of the wisdom of all of the development from 1.1 to 1.5, and particularly getting into 1.6 as sort of the counterbalance of it, is this very Promethean and human and ingenuity way. Whereas the Gaian is where when you shift into second sapiens, this is where you're really starting to anchor in that Gaian intelligence and knowing that there's all these layers of, it's interesting. I love hearing you're bringing up the polarity of it all, right? Of the back and forth, right? You can almost think about these things as a series of like nested harmonics and infinity loops that are going in, right? It's like, and the reason why I like breath as an example is so embodied you can feel is like if you just keep breathing in, you're going to have trouble, right? Like there is goodness of breathing in, right? Of you're bringing in oxygen, but eventually that oxygen is going to set up where you're going to be building up carbon dioxide that needs to be flown out, right? And that buildup of that negative of like holding your breath is a healthy thing, right? That's that shadow side that we often ignore, right? And then you flow it out. You have carbon dioxide that's being released as you breathe out. That's a good, healthy thing. But the more you keep breathing out, there's a buildup of a need for oxygen, right? And that's that sort of shadow side. And so it's like I'm hearing you basically saying, watch the infinity loops and know that they
Right,
all matter.
absolutely.
And don't just focus on breathing in, right? Metaphorically, it's almost like culturally we get into stuck where we think we can only breathe in, metaphorically speaking, right? And so you're saying all of these fractal patterns of like that simple little dynamic to then developmentally it's happening, right? From 1.1 and 1.2 balancing each other, 3, 4, right? And then even there, there's then even a broader, like, so think about the micro of a breath to then the micro of a development to then the structure of Promethean to Gaian, and knowing that these actually need to be in a healthy balance together. And that's kind of what I'm picking up from you as sort of the layers of dynamics that you're trying to get up, and that metaphor is a great way to get that started. Am I picking that up about right?
That is the perfect example, Eric, because breath is common to all of us. You know, you breathe
We can
in,
all
you have
feel
to
it.
breathe out.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And and to think that all we need is oxygen and to take it in as a metaphor to the good things that we need. No, you have to exhale, and that completes the loop. That completes the pair of opposites. In balance, being fully aware that that is the entire dynamic. That is the whole, not just the part that we have embraced since the age of enlightenment,
Yeah.
that only sees the bright side, that only sees the oxygen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There
Although
it
it's
is.
good, you need to exhale, you need to exhale.
You need to exhale. Right?
Yeah.
So let's get to that, right? Because so now let's get into the Gaian intelligence, right? So that was a particular key part of your book, right? Like it seemed like something you were really recognizing and you were grappling with within the book was how, there was so coming back, you gave a great introduction. You particularly brought up Dr. Claire Graves, who is a professor contemporary of Maslow. You go into a great history of all of this. You go into depth. So everyone who wants to really get into the depths of this theory and this work, and also get into some of the original academic work and literature that built this, that then Don Beck built on, and you were building on, right? Go into the book. Fantastic. There's all sorts of stuff there. And and what I really want to get into is in the book, you started getting into a lot of depth on the sort of recognizing that it was even the stuff that was this really foundational part, you're to use the metaphor of Prometheus, you're recognizing the Promethean nature of it, right? It's sort of like there was something here that wasn't completely held in a way, and it was basically recognizing that Gaian intelligence, nature, natural laws is really a much deeper set of wisdom and intelligence that we're not properly tapping into, right? And so I'd love to can you tell those who haven't read the book a little bit about that and kind of your own evolution of how you were kind of recognizing and realizing that and why that's so important for this growing into being more of a stable second sapiens kind of perspective.
Yeah, yeah. So back in about 2015, 2016, I began to, a profound discussion with Don Beck about, everything was coming up, whether it's the VUCA, the volatility, uncertainty, and so forth. That
Complexity,
paradigm
yeah,
came up.
ambiguity, yeah,
Yeah, and and that's really when issues of climate change started, to appear more in media, to appear more in concerns of, for future thinkers and so forth. And the conversation basically that Don Beck and I had is that is our model uh, ready, or does it have the parameters to really be able to address all this complexity? And Don Beck being from Texas loves to use simple metaphors that would like, all he has to say is one word and say, wow, yeah, that's an insight, and suddenly your thinking moves up 3 stages, and he kept repeating to me, Saeed, you're not zooming far enough. You need to see this issue from Jupiter.
mm,
And so after much thought, I began to do research on, on issues of why, man-made systems are beginning to collapse and there's nothing in its place. But more importantly, the greater environment in which this whole thing exists was under collapse and no one has been able to address it effectively. So I started, the purpose of the book was to really try to address, to bring awareness to how we can address some of the issues with climate change. And so I began to do research into, climate issues. And the more research I've done, the more of like whatever the scientific research was like 2 or 3 months before, new research shows that that wasn't true. That, for example, the degree at which the polar ice is melting. One research came up in like 2014 that says we have gauged the polar ice to be happening at twice the historic rate. And so, as I use that as you know, a sort of like an anchor to my scientific argument. And then, a year later, new research comes out that says, oh no, we were wrong about that research. Ice melt is happening at 4 times the rate we originally thought. And you begin to see a lot of those planetary science issues that are proving that the current scientific methods haven't been vetted enough, that we have really haven't embarked on extensive, deeper research into the things that are affecting the planet. The most important thing that makes economic system and all the lower systems in it viable. And so, as I began to think about these things, the conversation I had with Beck, he asked me if, I'm going to do a presentation at one of the trainings about seeing life from Jupiter. And I basically said, Don, that's going to require the repurposing of the entire model, especially
Mhm.
second tier, especially stages 7 or 8. He
Yeah.
goes, so if anybody can do it, it's you. And that hit me like, an awesome responsibility that I need to
And the
start
invitation.
thinking differently about this whole thing. So to just bring this back to both the integral theory model and spiral dynamics model, when Ken and Don created their models, and they joined forces to create spiral dynamics integral. So there was a hybrid model that brought the two communities together. But
Mhm.
when they created these models, uh, climate change wasn't a big issue. Climate wasn't even on the radar. So the use of their models defaulted to using the intelligence in it to address human-built systems. And so to me, I had to like sort of, okay, well, that intelligence is human intelligence. There's something bigger here that we're not accounting for. There's a degree of science that we haven't tapped into. And as I looked at some lesser known research from Graves, in one of the lectures he gave, he begins to talk about what's beyond Newtonian science. I'm like, wow, the answer could be here. So I tore that whole lecture apart and realized that, science begins at stage 5. And so that is the Newtonian reductive method, the way
Gotcha.
we go about scientific research. It's great. It provides answers to 95% of our solutions now. But that 5% that has to deal with greater issues, the planetary, systems challenges, have not been tapped into. And that's where the intelligence needs to move to. So as I research more, he mentions that the stage 6 science has to do with, Albert Einstein's theory of relativity and Niels Bohr quantum physics. Theory of relativity says everything is relative. Relativistic values is the theme of the 6th stage. And quantum physics basically says we are all the same at a molecular level. We're all,
And
we're
there's an
all
inherent
carbon
uncertainty.
atoms.
Yeah.
Yeah. So to me it was wow, okay, so yeah, this makes sense. And then in that same lecture, he says, what you were beginning to see immediately after the end of World War II is the idea of systems thinking, that we can no longer think in silos. And I think people misunderstand what systems thinking is all about. It is not the abandonment of Newtonian science.
Yeah.
It is the observation of what you do in a silo. So basically, the research, if I take something out of its environment and put it in a petri dish and do experiments on it, I would understand much of its characteristics. That's Newtonian science. That provides a lot of solutions, a lot of cures for diseases and so forth.
Yeah.
But what systems thinking says is you take that and you put it back in the environment that you pulled it out of to see how it interacts with the rest of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
And so your understanding of the ecosystem and the way that interacts outside a petri dish under natural conditions is essential to how complex adaptive systems work. And so, well, so I discovered that adaptive complex system, and then complex systems are part of that seventh level science. But then there was a higher science, and I did research in that and found the answer in a book that a thinker by the name of uh, Fritzkoff Capra wrote. And the title of the book is The Complex Adaptive Systems of Life. And so in it, he makes the argument that the intelligence that brought life into existence 3.5 billion years ago is far more complex than the human intelligence that, by its very nature, is frail and vulnerable and and everything else. I'm like, well, so we can't, the Anthropocene, the era that we're in, says it's us humans who are responsible for saving ourselves. So
Yeah.
how do we adapt the model to shift our thinking? And it's going to take a lot of humility for people to say, or the scientific community to say, and believe me, Eric, I've got a lot of resistance from science reporters who are evaluating the book, and they say, no, you're dismissing science. And I said, you don't understand the model.
Yeah.
This is the transcend and include. You still need the Newtonian science, but
Yeah.
that's a smaller part of the greater science. And so I ran into that kind of resistance. But the idea that there is the Gaian sciences, the natural intelligence science, is a reality that exists. It has existed for 3.5 billion years. And just in the last 500 years, we appointed ourselves as the answer for all scientific, inquiry through the little lens of the Enlightenment. Well, the challenge now is to have some humility and say, wow, we recognize that natural intelligence has been around a lot longer than we have.
Yeah.
How do we adopt that behavior? How do we learn to mimic the behavior of Mother Nature and adopt it into our systems that we can survive this calamity called climate change and, the different planetary systems that are in collapse? So the shift is from human intelligence to natural intelligence. And it takes a lot of humility to understand that this is beyond who we are.
Yeah.
That we have to come back to nature. We have to come back to the sense that we don't know everything, to the sense that, essential to this stage of science that comes from the eighth stage of development is the idea that everything has a feedback loop. And we
Mm.
have to, again, back to the pair of opposites.
Yeah.
We have to account to the action for our reactions. Mother Nature does it with the simplest thing. I have a plant here in my office. If I don't water it, every week it dies. Action, reaction, loop. You don't account for the loop. It's going to contribute cumulatively to that shadow that seems to be breaking now. The shadow is causing planetary systems to collapse.
Yeah.
And there's such higher order that we don't know what state of collapse they're in.
Yeah.
So that's the basic premise of the book, is that we need to begin to inquire more into this eighth stage science that is going to save us. And if we don't do it, and we don't have the coalescence of authority, power, and influence to pursue it urgently, we're not going to be able to save ourselves. I mean, it's just going to become an issue of we are at the mercy of Mother Nature, and she will do whatever she wishes with us. And
Yeah.
to a lot of people, that's not comfortable, but that's reality. That's where we're heading into.
Well said. And I'm going to link this to some of the stuff that we've been doing in this podcast, right? So, just to name this in the ways that we've been exploring it here, right? So the episodes that I put together and then I interviewed people on, I was trying to articulate. I called it a metaphysical foundation, right? But another way you could say this is basically trying to reestablish our sense on how does nature work in a way that honors nature on their own, on a Gaian's term, right? To put it into your language or nature's way, right? So the basic idea, I was trying to simplify it into these 6 words, which was basically life breathes, islands shape, beings adapt. And what I was drawing from was the best that we had from various sciences. So from physics and geoscience, basically the idea that we live in a universe of constant exchange. There, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? That constant flow, right? And using breath as both as a metaphor, but then also very consciously inviting and expanding the notion of what life is, to really recognize like we couldn't possibly exist if there weren't all these amazing, like almost miraculous and wonderful balancing loops that our Gaian mother offers us, right? Like the one of the amazing balancing act between volcanism, volcanoes coming up, and erosion. That is in balance on our planet, and that is exceptionally rare, and it is absolutely required for us to exist, right? And so I had this great conversation with Marcia Bjornerud, who wrote this book Timefulness, and we really kind of explored that. And she, in particular, named this, that's something that the area in the geosciences as they've been engaging. There's this idea from a physicist named Hart of sort of, as you named it, Newtonian science, which is basically focusing on the universal and the principle. And so, or you could almost use another name, it might be called nomothetic sometimes, right? But that's getting dorky. And then the other side is more of Darwinian science, which is really about understanding the flow of in people, place, and time, and knowing that those are also a breathing polarity. You know, it's like
Yeah.
they need to be in dynamic, and that was basically what our whole life breathes conversation was about, right? And then the
Yeah.
island's shape. This is talking and working from the work of Rob Dunn, an ecologist, and basically
Yeah.
saying and recognizing that we are any notion of when you try to draw a boundary object and you say that like you're holding that as true, it's like you're lying to yourself. That was an invented concept. That bound anytime you put it, a rock to a person, like all one of those things is basically if you live in a universe of constant exchange, we are all, and using the metaphor, we are all islands that are constantly shaping and being shaped by others, right? The microbiome that like, exists within us, we are their island that, and they are shaping how we as an island exist, just as when we exist within an ecosystem we are shaping that, right? And so that's a place of constant exchange and otherwise. So that's the island's shape. And then the last piece is bringing in the neuroscience of knowing that we are beings that we as human beings have the capacity to not just have engage with sort of the physical reality of the world and the sort of material elements of this, but also invent reality, social reality, like the invention of money. And money doesn't only exist because we all agree it exists, right? And so we have this amazing superpower of literally inventing social norms, institutions, concepts, and you can basically say this is like the superpower of Promethean intelligence. You know,
Yeah.
it's like there it is. That's like the 1.1 to 1.6. We have this capacity to invent new worlds and bring those things that we dream into existence. It's like the world of pure imagination, you
Yeah.
know, and yet it's a superpower that could go really wrong because if you're not actually properly tethered into life breathes and islands shaping, you
Yeah.
very likely are going to destroy yourself. And that's probably a key reason why so many of other societies have collapsed. You know, think about the like the Bronze Age collapse or otherwise. It came down to when our processes that tether us to nature and to have that deeper wisdom of like what does it mean to live in right relationship break
Yeah.
down, right? And so many ways it was inviting that neuroscience. So I'm just kind of naming this to say if
Yeah.
there are others, and I'm a scientist, right? I'm trained as a behavioral scientist. I'm a systems scientist, systems thinker, do all this kind of stuff, right, in my own work, right? I'm just kind of, and so I can then reinforce how I use it and do all that kind of stuff within my own work. But all of this is just to reinforce, Said, I think you're, you know, I think you have a very good lens and framework that I think makes a lot of sense. And I think if you actually look at more of the totality of the science and actually have a deep understanding of how they actually work in this with a polarity lens, you know, you're just setting us up to that sort of healthy invitation. So I just kind of want to give a bit of a almost a follow-up testimonial of like, it's interesting. Folks are pushing back. I would say that's my pushback on that pushback, basically. So,
Well, thank you for being in my corner on that on that specific issue. But yeah, everything that that you mentioned, Eric. I mean, it just it once we look at the different what we call in spiral dynamics the stage development attractors, so around the strategic thinking and the scientific thinking that was born out of the Enlightenment, we develop, our philosophy on life becomes different because of those issues of enlightenment. Our
yeah,
scientific paradigm changes. How we, our economy gets informed and gets enacted changes. Our political structures change. These are all called value system or stage development attractors that define the totality of culture. And
yeah,
so, what I do in my work is that, to in order for us to really be able to address these bigger issues, we need to bring it out of the silos that, the philosophy doesn't talk to neurology, and
yeah,
so it becomes, it becomes more an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach that allows us to integrate. And all we have to do is really watch the wonder and the mystery of how these things naturally integrate. The
yeah,
idea that you have to have absolute scientific proof about how something exists through the lenses of Newtonian reductionism is a recipe for failure. We
amen.
have to realize that there are things that are just that we're beginning to understand. The whole, you mentioned neurology. In the study of Gaian intelligence, neurology becomes the study of the neurosphere. You
Yeah,
know, biology becomes the study of the biosphere.
yeah,
Psychology becomes eco-psychology. All these value system attractors, all these stage attractors have to become universal in reach and have to become considerably more collaborative
Yeah.
in order for us. I mean, these are all different facets of the same diamond that need to come together to show us the beauty of what we have.
Yeah.
You know, one scientist I go, Howard Bloom, who wrote a book called the Global Brain. He basically says that the human intelligence is nothing more than neurons on the surface of the greater brain that has been in existence for 3.5 billion years. You know, that is what you know, the vastness of knowing what we're all about. You know, it is that big. And once we really understand that, you know, we're as a species we've only been around, you know, 300 till further evidence appears, we've only been around 200 to 300,000 years.
Yeah.
And that, you know, life has been carbon dated to go as far back as 3.5 billion years.
Yeah.
And that it didn't emerge by accident. You know, Mother Nature is there doing everything that you talked about. You know, we use the concept of allometry. Allometry is, you know, proper sizing for a certain organism to survive.
Yeah.
You know, Mother Nature's been doing it for 3 billion years.
Yeah.
You know, we're just coming into it and realizing that there's a scientific term that we can give to it, but it has existed before language appeared.
Yeah.
You know, so that's that's the mystery. You just have to have faith that there's something higher than just the what we've taken for granted the last 100 years or so,
Right.
and you begin to tap into it, and just look at it as a possibility. You know, till something emerges that says, "Aha, this is what I was looking for. Therefore, I'll begin to incorporate my findings into what I already know." And
Yeah.
that's really how moving to higher stages begins.
Yeah, I love that. And I want to name also the sort of transcend and include, right? Like the thing that you bring up in the book on there was particularly how there's echoes, from like 1.1 to 2.1 and then 2.2, right? And particularly, the sort of what I was picking up was how particularly 2.2, there's a lot of important echoes, which I think we're now seeing in indigenous wisdom and indigenous practices, particularly this critical importance of just living in right relation with all of life and humanity and otherwise. And so that's another thread that's been weaving quite a lot. But I was seeing that very clearly of sort of like, and also just naming it. It's like this, I think that's something that I think is sort of an issue when the notion of development comes into play is this idea of sort of better or worse. But the language you keep saying is transcend and include. It's not a better or worse. It's just knowing that it's almost like there's this vast symphony, and they have the whole, then you're singing with a chorus, right? So you have all these people singing like soprano, alto, you have your so yeah, your orchestra and everything is all happening, right? And what you're doing is you're sort of what the way I've been starting to think more and more, and I'm hearing this is it's almost like we as humans and as a culture, we start to be able to zoom in to different facets of the harmonics that are already happening, right? And so early on, all we can just hear is the voices, right? And then maybe we start to be like, oh, wait a minute, there's a bass section here. Like, oh, wait a
Yeah,
minute, there's actually the whole violins are doing something over here, right? And then there's an oboe, and like you can start to actually hear that all of those harmonics have always been there. And
right,
what I hear you doing with spiral dynamics is having that capacity to zoom in on the various harmonics in a
right,
healthy way, such that you can tune to it, you can work with it, you can say, okay, how can I get this to be, working harmonically with everything else, right?
right.
It's sort of like, I don't know, I'm offering a metaphor here. Be curious how that
I mean,
lands on you.
absolutely, absolutely, yeah. The you know, I mean, this is how Graves paints the movement from from the different tiers that have remained undiscovered, un not discovered. Uh,
Yeah,
he basically compares it to a symphony
here we
of
go.
people, yeah, yeah, of different instruments are different stages of development that come together in a beautiful symphony, and that's really the outcome is not to listen to one instrument separately. It is a part of the whole, and that's what makes music. You
Yeah,
know. Now,
bet.
now the metaphor that he began to use, but Beck used a lot more, and I really embrace in the book, is the idea of holonic structures, of fractal formations, and as it relates to the model. And I use some of the Graves language that says basically, if you're at the lower holonic structure, so you say you're at stage two, and if you're familiar with how holons work, there's a fixed rule that determines what the holonic structure is all about. And then you use various strategies to determine how to reach that. So those are the like the peripheral expressions of a system. But if you realize in one system, that's the fixed rule. If you're live in a tribalistic culture as it appeared historically, there is nothing higher than that. That becomes the fixed rule. But then you move higher up the stage, and that higher stage becomes the fixed rule, and then the lower stages become the variables in which you have to consider, every intelligence that has defined that as part of the whole. And so holonic structures, in a sense, work that way to accommodate the totality of the complexity that we have.
Yeah. I love it. And this is so helpful. And so I feel like now you and I have been creating a shared understanding and also a shared understanding of those who are listening to us. I want us to now start using it, right? Like let's use it to start thinking about our present moment and what this might mean growing into the future. And there was a lot of layers that you brought into. So we've already alluded to it. We've alluded to the notions of shadows, the importance of being able to hold all and see all aspects, including those things that might be perceived as more negative, right? That stuff that we kind of push away and other and turn into it, right? We've talked about notions of tricksters and otherwise a little bit. Um, so let's jump into this a little bit, right? Like as you're thinking about this, let's start with that shadow work for a bit. Like,
Yeah.
so this is an idea, particularly, again, we're thinking cultural evolution. We're not thinking about individuals here, right? We're really trying to think about like, what is our cultural shadow that this moment is inviting us to see? This is a notion of Carl Jung. I don't think we need to get into the depths of that. If you want, look up Carl Jung, look up his shadow work, you can kind of get into that. But he tends to orient towards individuals. But of course, he has the collective mind. He gets into it a bit into the collective as well, right? But I want to get it into this collective frame of like what do you see as the kind of key cultural shadows that we, whether that be as communities, nations, or even global humanity, those parts of it that basically we haven't been able to fully see, appreciate, and maybe even avoid or push or other. What are those things that you're seeing and that we really need to be facing about ourselves right now? What are
Yeah.
those hidden pieces?
Yeah. So we really don't use the shadow language as much in spiral dynamics as, let's say integral theory or other,
Okay, you can use a different
uh,
language if you want. That's fine, particularly because you're in
so
that cultural
the, the
space.
way the way I reframe issues of shadow, Eric, is that if you think you can move up the hierarchical development ladder without addressing the unhealthy aspects of each stage, you are contributing to building up that shadow. That
I
you
like that
really
way of framing that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so you'll be hamstringed, if you will, somewhere in the developmental journey where let's say you've had a rough upbringing. It affected how you relate to the second stage of development, which is the very basic tribe is the family structure. But you grew up in an abusive environment, and so you reject stage two altogether. But then
Mm.
later in life, you realize that you can't do something. You can't be intimate. You can't, develop good relations. It is because you skipped that stage. And so that was a shadow that created at a time that needs to be addressed, that you need to move into the full healthy expression of that system. So you come back and fix it. When you begin to see it objectively, when you become a witness to it, that this is really stopping me from having close friends and relationships. What is the cause of this? And you might be sitting on a therapist chair and it might say, okay, yeah, this is the cause of it. I need to go back and fix my second stage system.
Mm.
And so
It's
the,
the
the the
integration
healthy
work.
emergence. Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. The healthy emergence is that, the unhealthy expression of every stage is the lazy way out. You know, the
Mm.
the the real responsible, psychologically healthy way for individuals and society as a whole is to come face to face with the unhealthy aspect of society, and empower the healthy aspect of it that will substitute for the or fix whatever ever unhealthy expression of that system was. And so that enables you to move up the spiral. But what's happening now, especially when, with this most recent economic cycle, the
Yeah.
the the only money matters cycle that I
Yeah.
that I've termed began, from the 1980s, is that we've like tipped the economic model upside down. We made finance, as a as the primary purpose of economic systems. And in the process, we made it the tail that wagged the dog. I
Yeah.
mean, to me, that's a fallacy. And if you continue down that fallacy, it just the shadow, the unhealthy aspect of that fifth stage of development, and it's a fractal of that fifth stage of development, becomes less and less healthy. And eventually it will manifest in a collective disease. It's manifests in dysfunction. It manifests in, you know, someone's ability to destroy lower stages that have taken, decades, if not centuries, to build.
Yeah.
I send you a graphic that shows, what happens when we weaken that fourth stage of development. The institutions that are responsible for regulating, with the example of in the United States, with the first Reagan administration, we began to view any regulatory structures as the enemy of the private sector. And
Right.
so we systemically began to deregulate our industry. Well, what happens when there isn't the rule of law that says you can't do this? But not only are you doing it to stage three, the criminal element, okay, you're also doing it to stage five that says, your white collar practices can't be this. So what happens when you thin that layer of the fourth stage of development? It's all about shadow. It's all about unhealthy practices that come both from stage three and stage five. And the end of it, the trajectory, if we keep going in that direction, is the complete death of institutions. It's going to be mayhem.
Yeah.
It's going to be, oligarchical powers that are going to be in charge of our destiny, just like, the times of the Gilded Age that, a few decades later resulted in the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Everything's expedited this time. We've been in this and should have, seen the end of it with a financial crisis, but we haven't. So the shadow has only grown bigger
Yeah.
once we move that past that maturity stage and ignored the fact that we need, higher values to regulate our economy. It's so the application of the whole paradigm on shadow is different in spiral dynamics, especially when you apply it to cultures.
Yeah.
We've exported our capitalist model to the rest of the world that might not have experienced it nor have the capacities to apply it the way we do, which will contribute to their shadow. People who, countries that are rich in natural resources, they think they're in stage five of development, when in reality, a simple sort of thin slicing to determine whether a culture is in stage five of development, just look at how many scientific papers they produce a year per capita.
Hmm.
And if that's low, they're not in stage five. It's they're borrowing from stage five because they have money to build high rises and develop a modern infrastructure. But if
Mhm.
the world collapses, they just don't have the innovation, the indigenous innovation to survive on their own.
Yeah.
So this is really at the heart of what causes much of the dysfunction that we're seeing around the world.
Yeah, I so appreciate it. And it sounds maybe just to play with it a little bit more on this, right? So I like that your frame is basically like for every when you're using the spiral dynamics frame, you're basically saying there's always an unhealthy aspect that can emerge and it can start to metastasize and kind of grow and become almost self-reinforcing, right? And they can play off of each other, right? So you're really saying like stage 1.4 in the first sapiens space is really where all of the sort of institutional checks and balances on almost all the other stages come into play, right? It's really like you're building a check on egocentric, dictatorial kind of pulses and impulses, and those that want to become, reestablish feudalism, which, Yanis Varoufakis is basically saying we're going into techno-feudalism, where it's basically we're shifting from, not just charging rent for land, we're also charging rent for the cloud, right? And hence the sort of integration of those. And you can see why Silicon Valley and Donald Trump actually might have a lot of in common because they're basically establishing a new feudalistic structure that just happened to incorporate the internet. But it's still the basic idea of we own stuff and we're going to charge you rent and we're going to extract because we happen to have this sort of thing, right? To then the 1.5 element, right? The dark element that can come there is the manipulation, right? And the ways in
Right.
which you can use science to say, I have this view, and particularly I've got this reductive element, so I'm going to push this on everyone within there. That's going to fall apart. And then the 1.6, the shadow element there that you were bringing up is basically, well, everyone is equal, and so we don't have any hierarchy. So there's no notion of like being able to like have a notion of like of the values of efficiency that start to come into play when you actually put trust and authority into institutions and otherwise. And in so doing, basically all of these are dissolving what was originally created, probably more around like the Catholic Church, and at least in European cultures and otherwise, right? All of that stuff that then got turned into our government structures and otherwise, all of that is basically attacking that, and it is just not strong enough to handle it. Hence, it's like, and then just coming back to the way I framed it from this opening podcast, I was basically saying the civic, spiritual, and natural processes that tether us to reality. This is
Mm.
it. We're
Yeah.
saying it right now, right? And so it's like we're going through this fundamental collapse. And so part of it is just to see it and to recognize it and to recognize that, there might be a desire to be like, oh, well, we shouldn't have authoritarians. We shouldn't have scientists. We shouldn't have, folks who are really egalitarian minded. We shouldn't have institutions. No, 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 no. Those are not the answers. The answer is actually we need to find the good aspects of those and getting them to be working in a healthy harmonic, like a symphony or in a holonic structure as you use with that. I just use symphony because I think it's more accessible, but yeah. So that's what I'm kind of picking up from you as sort of how you're diagnosing this from biodynamics. Is that, what did I get right, wrong? How would you tweak that?
Right on with your diagnosis, Eric. The additional element I want to add to this is the idea of how the digital age has disrupted traditional ways that we have acquired knowledge since we learned how to read and write.
Yeah.
The idea of how Darwinian nature of not development, but how our cognitive abilities develop. If there's one idea, a theory or a hypothesis proposed by a scientist, another scientist come along and says, this is a better model, and it gets vetted, and it proves to be a better model. Those traditional hierarchical ways of picking the best ideas that survive, this is how our knowledge base, what informs our institutions and our culture. This is how traditionally we build these systems.
Yeah.
And suddenly the digital age comes in where it says, no, 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 everybody has equal to how knowledge is accumulated. We now follow influencers as if they are top scientists, when
Right.
in reality, the whole notion, so the whole digital age is a representation of the sixth stage of development. In a sense, it wants to democratize information and resources.
Right.
But the way we're going about it and the way we're adopting it so quickly without understanding, the fourth stage implications of it is just a prescription for disaster.
Yeah.
And it's just, I'm really surprised that not enough research has been put into this, because it is disrupting the traditional way of how humanity has emerged at
Yeah.
a profound level. And it's moving structures away from traditional structures that we have known. With the advent of AI, and especially the way they're pushing it, there's research that shows, jobs are 50% of our jobs are going to disappear within the next decade.
Yeah.
It's a way to developmentally that needs to be looked at.
Yeah.
Developmentally, there needs to be higher wisdom that sees the digital age for what it is, but call it out on things that are damaging to society, because it is it is operating without a regulatory structure that understands what needs to be regulated. I mean,
Yeah.
our government officials don't know how to regulate, and they still view regulation as a bad thing, leave
Right.
alone the fact that they understand how the internet works.
Right.
I mean, these are the challenges that we're facing, and yeah, unfortunately, that's an element that has disrupted really developmental models historically, and it's like we're looking at inspiration on how to address this thing. How do we recreate the institutions that we've held so dear to ourselves in the virtual sense? How do you create the force system with its enforcement mechanisms in the virtual world to ensure that similar checks and balances in society? And now we're talking about, this is a global issue.
Yeah.
How do you recreate those stages of development in the virtual sense, that everything stays in check, that at least the growth of society under the influence of the digital age parallels that to how we've emerged as a humanity for the last 300,000 years.
Yeah.
That's really the challenge that no one's addressing.
Right. And I'm just playing with the harmonics of spiral dynamics for a moment, right? Like, so 2.2 then, just to kind of land on that for a moment, coming to the second sapiens point, right? Like 2.2, I think you could probably imagine incorporating all of those elements, and I can hear it actually harkening back to the conversation I just had earlier with Matt Bigger. And basically, he's a fellow, Stanford alum, and he runs this work on systems change and otherwise. And he wrote this fantastic book called Connected to Place, and it has this sort of beautiful, unmanageable simplicity. He's also system science, systems thinker, and it's like he's like working through all that strategic work of how do we actually do this, but like at its core, like I see him as basically integrating a lot of the core, basically moral philosophy and wisdom of indigenous practice, which I would frame as basically live in right relationship with people, place, and like really be connected, right? And then grow into that. And so there's sort of an unmanageable simplicity is the way I was sort of experiencing this, right? It's like simple, just connect to place, connect to each other, right? But there's a richness to that, but it's sort of like a reimagining of tribalism as sort of
Right,
like this network of local villages, right? And
right.
for him, that's a central part. But I almost hear you hearkening to is like there's actually then we don't know it yet. We haven't fully grown into this, but there's got to be some folks who actually know how to work at a 2.4 level of understanding, which is saying, "Koi, you have those network of villages, but then you need an institutional structure that actually is working in a Gaian intelligence to actually start to allow these networks to work in a way that maybe is not being mediated by a UN functioner of 1.6. You're not working at a nation state structure, was it at the 1.4 to 1.5? It's fundamentally differently and it's likely much more holonic in its structure, right? And I'm just
Absolutely.
naming this and playing with the structure more and more. It like these are the kind of things that it sounds like your paper and your work and what you're really inviting of like why we need to be called into second sapiens is like having the capacity to kind of see, understand, interrogate, and start to collectively create this sort of different meta structure is what we're kind of it seems like what we're grappling with. Is that fair? Is that how did that land on you?
You're right on with that, Eric. The issue of what the second sapient intelligence, although I don't address it as a issue that has to do with our digital state of being, the general theme, if you will, of stage 8 or 2.2 is to through wisdom, through metaphysics, through capacities that we hadn't used as first sapiens as much as we should, through these different capacities that have always been with us, create an ecologically aligned humanity. I mean, that's the theme. That is the meta meme
That's it.
of stage 2.2, is to create an ecologically aligned humanity.
That's
And what
beautiful.
we need to do is to be able to understand how our entire journey has been through the industrial age, through the stage 1.5 that has created so many of the ecological issues that we have now, to learn from what happened there and what went wrong, and put mechanisms in place that the seventh stage will do, but also begin to differentiate that at the end it's human wisdom that's going to get us through this. It's not going to be AI. AI has no clue on what the sciences of the eighth stage look like because there's nothing to mine. We
It's
haven't
not
really
work in
been
progress.
invested in science.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It hasn't really, I mean, it could give us advice on, what sages have done and said in the past, but how do you align that into human wisdom that creates that space that says we are an ecologically aligned humanity. There's a superordinate power here that we all understand and adhere to, where ecological collapse is a reality.
Yeah.
And these are all that. And that requires a higher degree of intelligence. That requires a greater degree of humility. It requires us to be in charge of the things that we create, not subordinate to it. As of now, very few people understand, the dark side of AI. We don't consider it because it's a big thing now. Oh, great! I can, if I want to write an article or if I want to understand a summary of a book, I just feed it to AI and it gives me, those
Yeah.
are the Promethean aspects of
Yeah.
AI.
That's
But we're dismissing the other pair of opposite is that, you input some wrong data into it, and it just gives you something that, through several iterations would look exactly the opposite of what we need. And
right.
so human wisdom needs to step back into this through being in awe of existence, through the mystery that existed in stage 1.2, in relation to the cosmos, in relation to our spirituality. And I'm not talking about organized religion. I'm talking about what's innate in each and every one of us. Our ability to even try to understand the mystery and be in awe and in the humility of how small we are.
Yeah.
It is that the greater power here, we have angered it to the point that, we live at the mercy of Mother Nature.
Yeah.
And that we need to really step into our ancient wisdom combined with everything that we learned technologically, digitally, and everything else to be able to effectively address the issues that we face.
Yeah, I love it. And what I'm hearing here is, and knowing we've been talking for a while, so I want to make sure we kind of, there's at least one or two things, and then I want to allow you to go. But I'm so grateful that we've had this time, right? What I'm hearing here, just again playing with the dynamics, right, is like 1.1 was survivability, right? And so 2.1 is basically Gaian intelligence with survivability, right? And so basically what this is I think what you're really inviting as a starting point is just we need humanity to come to the reckoning of we are on the brinks of collapse, right? We are,
Yeah,
and so from a pure survivability perspective, we need to know that it's like when I'm with my son, we go to the ocean, and like particularly when he was like 5, when really young, I was like every time we went to the ocean, there was something I always said to him before he went into the ocean, which was basically between you and the ocean, who wins? And the answer was the ocean. The ocean always wins, right? It's like the ocean is just hell of a lot more powerful than you. There's no way you're going to win against the ocean. If the ocean wants to suck you out, the ocean will, right? To me, that's like a basics of the Gaian intelligence logic and sort of a 2.1 survivability point, right? Like I'm using it as a somewhat playful, but that general point of like, no, 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 we are literally killing Mother Earth. Like you brought up the planetary boundary, Rockstrom, which was brought up in one of my earlier episodes, right? Our planets, we've passed what I think 8 of the 9 planetary
right.
boundaries at this point, right? Like all of those natural, like the breathing things of our planet are breaking down. They are no longer working, and it's that stuff that literally allows us to exist. So a second sapien 2.1 space is just to reckon with that, right? And just to reckon that there is a real, very high possibility, and particularly a probability, probably, that we are moving in that direction if we don't all collectively, if we don't have a much stronger, vast waking up to this 2.1 awareness of basically for humanity to survive, we need to recognize that Mother Earth is stronger than us.
Yes, yeah, absolutely, absolutely, Eric. And yeah, I mean, you use the example of your son and the ocean being more powerful. I have problems dealing with the squirrels in my garden that keep eating
There you go.
the poor little
Oh, the
creatures. I don't
freaking
want to kill them,
smart.
but leave my damn tomatoes alone. Let me have some. Occasionally they eat half a tomato and bring it to my sliding door as if that thank you for your contribution. But it's it could be something that simple. Knowing how to understand natural intelligence and every creature that contributes to our ecosystem. But in a sense the whole idea of the second tier that we're in mimics the first tier. So when Graves first introduced his model, I really dug into this whole thing about what he calls the 6 upon 6 hypothesis that is now really getting to be proven in the sense that as you enter every tier, the theme of every stage repeats, but at an exponentially higher level. So
Yes.
at Sapiens 1.1, we were concerned with the survival of the individual. At Sapiens 2.1, we're concerned with survival, but it's not the individual anymore. It's the survival of all the species on the planet. It is the
Right.
survival of the planet itself.
Yeah.
And unless we begin to think in those terms, we're doomed as a species. And the primary, I mean, Mother Nature will go on, as a
Fill in.
species. Yeah, yeah, exactly. And so that's the predicament that we're in. I do want to mention something, and this is an interview that Don Beck did about a couple of years before he passed. Did an interview with someone from the integral community who asked him, now that he'd had 50 or 60 years of experience of using the model, if there is a new insight that he saw that wasn't prevalent to him when he first started working with it. He goes, "Yeah, I was naive and optimistic when I first started doing this, thinking that we evolve into higher stages through conscious will."
Yeah.
His experience was, and that of Graves, is that we only evolve to higher stages only after the current system collapses.
Yeah.
And so the variables that come in to shape the new system will look nothing like we expect.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, in concluding remarks, I just want to say to the people who are listening to this, that is not a reason for you not to really commit yourself to doing the best that you can in empowering what that new intelligence is going to look like. Because on the other end of that, the point of impact, we're going to call on the brightest people in the system to begin to say, not only I told you so, that collapse is here and happening, but also have thought of ways to redefine culture, to rebuild what remains of humanity at the time.
Yeah, there it is. And with that, there's two last things I want to get in because you brought into depth on the economics. You were trying to think through what this would look like. So I just want to invite that up, right? Like your work on memenomics and all this other stuff. Like, I would love you to just kind of talk about what's your sense of like the right economic structures and where might we get, you brought up like donut economics, circular economies. You brought up so many different things in the book, right? And so I invite people to read the book because Saeed went through great depth on this, but just a little bit of sort of like it sounded like an economic part was a critical part of how you were thinking about this, like which is basically thinking about it more generally. It's the healthy flow of resources, information, prestige, so forth and so on, right? So it's like it's nurturing healthy flows. How are you thinking about that? What's kind of coming up for you as you're sort of seeing all of this from a kind of an economic lens?
Yeah, well, Eric, as I really examined the nature of what's causing the planetary systems to collapse, I became despondent, like, to the fact that, I mean, you mentioned it yourself. We have gone past the boundaries of 8 out of the 9 different planetary systems, and now we're completely at the mercy of Mother Nature that has become far less merciful towards our species. So, to translate that back to how that will define a new economic system, it has to be driven by the values of degrowth. To keep consuming the way we're consuming, in another 30 years, we're going to need 1.7 planets. We just simply do not have the resources to carry on the way we're carrying on. Now, the whole new approach to economics, Eric, had to really take into account all the things that I discovered in my research. And that research primarily was planned around the planetary systems and the states that they're in. And as you said earlier, so far, 7 out of the 8 or 8 out of the 9 different systems that are identified as planetary systems that make the totality of life possible have gone past their tipping points, which means we are now at the mercy of nature that has become a lot merciless towards our species. And that if those trends continue, that resources are going to, our access to resources is going to drop off a cliff, and there's going to be all kind of mayhem that we have to experience. And so I, put forth as a new North Star for economics that is going to allow for life to continue on the planet is the idea of degrowth that's going to move us away from the whole idea. And it's, I talked earlier about reversal of where we are now. The current economic paradigm now that the whole world has embraced is the idea of grow or die. Well, the new idea is grow and die, because sensitive ecosystems don't show how they interact, and they contribute to that shadow. They contribute to the collapse of those systems. So I began to examine, with that really dreary outlook, as I began to explore, the science of planetary systems and what's causing the collapse. I began to think that, okay, well, that new direction has to be degrowth. And if that's the case, I need to examine some of the leading edge models and look at their applicability. And so what I came up with is that we should no longer look at the carbon footprint that our activity creates. We need to include the material footprint, which is an entirely different calculus, a lot more complex, and everything about that shows that we're not slowing down. And the bigger measure that we need to be concerned about is not the supply chain as we know it. It is the ecological supply chain that goes into every aspect of our extractive activities and evaluates the environmental impact from the point of extraction to the point of manufacturing, shipping, and the end product, and what happens to the products that we use after they go into the landfill. Unless we begin to look at it as a continuous chain of event that affects our ecology, we're not going to be able to address the challenges that we face. So through that paradigm, I looked at the circular economy and found certain aspects of it that might not be feasible. Primarily the degree to which we have to re-engineer the way we do things, accommodate so many things that are going to be expensive. The idea that certain things need to be built will to accommodate the circular economy is going to tax the material footprint. Similarly, with I examined the donut economy, and the donut economy is really the first model that uses the planetary framework that Rockstrom put forth.
Yeah.
And what it's, and so it has like two circles in it. One circle shows that economic activity has to remain within the bounds of the planetary systems, and the inner circle says that we still have to develop the rest of the world that hasn't been developed. Well, that dynamic doesn't work too well, with that. Research has shown that a culture that moves from being a tribalistic culture, 1.5, 1.2, to it becoming 1.4 and 1.5, using modern tools that are available to it, consumes anywhere from 100 to 200 times more resources
Oh my gosh.
than it did when it was in a tribalistic existence. So you really, this whole view on what modernity needs or how to become modern needs to change. We need to shift our thinking that, modernity doesn't have to go through the levels of consumptions that we take for granted. And so, it was these examination of these systems that, made me think that we really, most of the models that we have is still beholden to the global financial and distribution infrastructure that is existing. We need a different paradigm to begin to phrase this in the right way that takes degrowth as the guiding principle, so to speak, in order for us to really find effective solutions.
Wow. Thank you. I'm glad you're kind of just giving such a rich analysis and otherwise, and I'm really grateful for this. So, Syed, this was a fantastic conversation. I'm so grateful for you. The very last question I like to ask, and it is basically what are kind of three resources that you would recommend? Of course, beyond your book, Second Sapiens, I'm recommending it. It was fantastic. This whole thing was guided by it. There was so much more we didn't get into that honestly I wanted to, but this was a rich enough conversation as it is. Please, for those who are interested, please read Second Sapiens. And so beyond that recommendation, Syed, what would you recommend to the audience?
Okay, so yeah, for people who want to find out more about spiral dynamics and the principles of it, there are short video clips on a website called Value Match, valuematch.com. That's also a site where you can actually become a certified person who knows spiral dynamics. So I recommend that website. And for the advanced applications, for the macro applications of the theory, I would recommend my own website, secondsapiens.com or .org, which also leads you to memenomics.com. And there are articles and blocks on there that go back almost 20 years. And so that's really the macro advanced applications of the model. Now, as far as the books are concerned, they're really the two books that have impacted me the most. Aside from spiral dynamics, it's Wilber's A Theory of Everything, where he embraces the ideals of the Gravesian model as a development model. So I recommend that, and it also introduces you to aspects of integral theory. And the other book would be related to spiral dynamics, and it's not the original book. This is the Spiral Dynamics in Action book that was released in 2018, where both my late wife and I and a slew of other people who were the leaders of what we were doing in different parts of the world, the leaders of the Centers for Human Emergence from everywhere, from Canada, Mexico, all the way Moscow and Tel Aviv. Everybody contributed a chapter to that book. So Spiral Dynamics in Action is the name of that book. And yeah, highly recommend these two books and these two websites.
Perfect. That's great. Well, Saeed, this is such a pleasure. I'm really grateful for all your time.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. It was wonderful to share all that knowledge with you, and I'm glad we were able to make this into really a dynamic discussion. I miss that. Oftentimes I speak to to people in my community, so it's like preaching to the choir, or to people who are just coming into this that don't understand the developmental stages. But this was wonderful, and I'm glad we were able to do it. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Saeed, for what an amazing conversation. I'd like to start and end this reflection with breath. As Saeed described, the pair of opposites, light and darkness and whatnot, right? I offered breath as the metaphor, one that we've been using throughout this, right? It was the episode 2, Life Breathes, right? And I think it's just so critical to keep seeing why that is such a valuable embodying metaphor to help us understand, right? When we breathe in, we're breathing in good oxygen and life, right? But if we're only breathing in, you start to create a problem. The CO2 is building up. You need to exhale. And that's not bad, right? It's the completion. It creates the polarity. That's the opposites, right? That's the foundation, right? So that's the core pattern. So that's the thread I want to play with all of these reflections from here. It's basically is like, what if that pattern is fractal and it repeats at various scales? And what we need to be able to do is turn into, I'll start using the bit more poetically as the harmonics of this, right? But how do we start playing and tuning to those various harmonics? My sense, particularly after thinking about this and also checking a little bit with Saeed, who kind of thought these ideas I'm about to share resonate with him, right? This, it feels like if we can learn how to do this, this might be a critical secret on how we actually move forward on reimagining our civic, spiritual, and natural processes that tether us to reality. That was the foundation, right? Or another way to say it is we nurture a healthy culture evolution. So here's the things that are coming to me. First, I want to do this critical shift of basically in Saeed's description of spiral dynamics, right? It was a master class. You can go through it, a great history and all this, right? But critically, the whole foundation was really this notion of stages. And stages has an implicit linearity to it, right? Like one, two, three, this, then this, then this, and this. Right? It's interesting though, because he flagged that Graves always had this symphony metaphor in mind, which I've been using, right? The sort of idea of different instruments, harmonics, right? There's always been this play of back and forth, and yet the language of stages was really critical. And therefore by extension linearity, right? My question is this. What if we reframe it primarily and we kind of let go of the notion of stages? And instead, we start saying, what if the primary foundation is this polar opposites, the cycles, the harmonics, right? So if we think about it that way, then the next thing I think to anchor in is coming back to episode 4, right? What are we talking about right now with cultural evolution? We're talking about our species superpower, right? Our capacity to invent social realities, which we covered in depth in episode 4. So I'm not going to restate them, but it's basically like our minds can create concepts, right? And then we have the 5 C's: creativity, communication, copying, collaboration, and compression. And with this, we can create concepts, beliefs, norms, stories, rituals, routines, right? The in architecture that holds the social reality that allows us to get along together, right, in cultures. Coming back to it, the stages frame sets this up as a linear structure. But if we shift to cycles, which is what Saeed was saying, in my mind, it invites moving away from the word development to instead a different word, emergence. Now, I think emergence is a really, really important frame. Why? Because it's setting up the idea that with development, it has a sort of gravitational pull towards higher and always more, right? Something, so it's like stages 3 is better than stages 1. Stage 7 is better than 3, right? And all this sort of stuff, right? And of course, there is some truth here, right? Like you're definitely starting to particularly when we get to individual level kind of development, which I notice I'm separating. I'm going to come back to it at the end. But for now, so I think there actually is some wisdom when you think about it individually. But I want to even reframe it slightly to the word discernment in a moment, but we'll come back to that. For now, let's keep focusing on the idea of cultural evolution here, right? And it's really so these social reality concepts, right? So if we replace the word development with emergence, what it allows us to do, it allows us to, I think, honor the ideas and what has been observed using a developmental lens. And it helps, but then it also helps us to gain something crucial that I think it really misses, right? The emergent gives us the sense of like basically the idea that when conditions are right, new possibilities can come into existence. So think about it this way. Life emerges from the interactions of physical properties, chemistry and physics and whatnot, right? And when those physical properties, like the one I've talked about before is basically volcanism and erosion, like that's a critical thing for life to exist on Earth. When that stops working, life will stop working. Right? Or the same idea of like an ecosystem, an emergent possibility of organisms interacting. It ultimately is reliant upon life systems working together, right? A rainforest has properties that is emergent and beyond what any single species is, right? And so that's the critical distinction, right? Emergent possibilities set up this idea that both they are higher in some sense, but they're also simultaneously completely dependent upon the systems beneath them to function. Life can't exist without physical conditions. Rainforests can't exist without soil, water cycles, and so forth. As I said in this Medium post I wrote years ago, you can't plant a rainforest, right? Only when when only the right preconditions exist, so physical life and ecological stuff, you have a rainforest. When those start to disappear, the preconditions are disrupted, you have decline, you have collapse. And we're going to come back to that, right? So this is again the idea I thought about years ago about like playing with emergence, right? But now, as I had Said's model, particularly sort of seeing the six quote unquote stages, I started to say, oh, wait a minute, these might be emergent issues. And then if I just added the notion of polarity, well, now we've got something interesting, right? Because it's moving us away from the idea of like keep climbing to an idea that with emergence is basically that the higher you go, so to speak, the more you need to tend to what's beneath you, right? It's sort of an expansion, right? You need to hold that all of that. So if that's the case, well then let's reimagine, right? So that's the framework and whatnot. But now, like, what are the implications? What would that mean? Like, what would quote spiral dynamics or second sapiens theory look like if you let go of linear thinking and you anchored around harmonics and cycles? Well, in my mind, those six quote unquote stages would be reframed as three polarities in dynamic tension, right? And I offer this as a hypothesis for dialogue and debate. None of this is settled, right? But imagine basically the first two, the harmonic between individual survival and belonging, right? That sets up when those are working in a healthy way, you create conditions for kinship, right? This breath between self-preservation and connection. Next, when you have the three and four, so this is the sort of leadership side, three, and the institutions, four, when those are working together, you create the conditions for a healthy, evolving governance, right? The individuals are challenging and getting all those things to become too rigid, unstuck, and the institutions keep it from being completely chaotic and just on the whims of a madman or otherwise, if that's who becomes the leader, right? So that's another dynamic, right? That's a polarity. Third polarity, when those are working, right, you then get the possibility of another emergent possibility of stewardship, right? This is our creative Promethean fire ingenuity of creativity and all of the social reality possibilities that we get at, right? To be able to create, and this is where our science, technology, engineering, mathematics, right? All of this, all of the ways in which humans have been able to dream and create new things, right? That is then balanced with the wisdom to ask the question of, does this serve all of life? Who is being hurt and marginalized? Who is being harmed? And how do we create a space where this deep, beautiful innovation is in service of the collective good, right? And hence stewardship? So if we have emergent logic, right, these aren't stages anymore. These are emergent possibilities, right? If you have the kinship worldview working well, you can then start to have the conditions where governance starts to become both needed and come online. As the government starts to become and healthy come online, you can get the emergent properties of a stewardship dynamic coming into play, right? If you don't have a good kinship, the government is going to collapse, the stewardship's going to collapse, right? So you need all of them in a culture to be working, right? And so that's the idea. Now, of course, these are just like a crazy hypothesis I just came up with as I've been thinking about this from Said's thing. Might be right, might be wrong. These might be the wrong logic, that might be the wrong structures. All of that's possible. I'm offering it as a hypothesis into broader conversation, right? Because ultimately what I'm trying to get is like, how do we start to get an anchoring on cultural evolution that doesn't fall into the classic trap of thinking that Western culture equals universally right? That's Orientalism. That's read the book by Edward Said, right? And I'm actually going to get into that in later episodes, right? right? But like we can't do that. Where like that's not the right solution. We know that's not right. But what if using this, we're starting to get an idea of like, oh, what are those common functions that might exist that all of us need to try to be nurturing in this sort of emergent system logic, and then recognize that cultures, what happens is they just take very different forms on how to actually produce those functions. Some of them are more or less functional or useful for actually hearing and attuning to all the harmonics. That's kind of what's coming to my mind within this. Right. So with that as a frame, right, that's sort of just like zooming in on the sort of Promethean wisdom, if you will, and sort of reimagining the linear structure of stages into instead the cyclical structure and the emergence of polarities that create emergent new possibilities. I think there's a deeper question though, because what I just set up is the idea of emergence is the more you go up, the more you need to go down. This is where I think Said's just freaking brilliant with the idea of the Promethean and the Gaian, right? So his metaphor was Prometheus is the metaphor for articulating and honoring human ingenuity, our fire, our forethought, right? This is science and technology and modernity, right? And then there's the Gaian intelligence, right? This is the deeper wisdom of Mother Earth and all of the life systems working together, right? So in this reframe, you can almost think of like these three cultural harmonics as the Promethean song, right? Or I'm going to use a term anthrophony, and I'll come back to that in a moment, right? And then beneath all that, though, always has never disappeared is Gaian's song, the biophony, right? And this is the physical life and ecosystems that have been interacting together for billions of years that created the conditions for the Promethean song to even come into existence and need to be working for a Promethean song to ever be in existence. Okay. So why did I use the word anthrophony and biophony? Well, this is actually building on the work of a soundscape ecologist named Bernie Krause. And you can go, I'm going to have the notes. There's a great TED talk that he gave that I'm kind of riffing off of. So he makes this distinction. So the anthrophony is basically the sounds of humans, the noise that we make, right? And then the biophony is the soundscape of nature. So he gives this really powerful example. If he talks about at Mono Lake, there were these thousands of spadefoot toads who vocalize in synchrony. Why? To protect themselves. When they're pulsating in synchrony, the predators can't figure out which one individual to pick off. So that's the biophony, right? But here's the rub. That's not far away from a US Navy base. And so the US Navy jets fly over that in training. And why does that happen? Those are freaking loud, right? And it just breaks the chorus. The toads fall out of sync. And it takes them about 45 minutes to regain their synchronicity anytime a jet flies over. What happened? Bernie Krause literally saw coyotes and owls going and moving in and picking off the vulnerable ones during those times of disruption. What did we do? The anthrophony literally broke the song that kept these toads alive. I think that is just such a powerful metaphor for understanding both the amazing power of Promethean intelligence as a jet and the ways in which it just makes it almost impossible for us to hear the biophone. Do you think the jet fighters have any clue that they just killed a bunch of toads? Of course not, right? They can't even hear it. It's not even in their capacity to hear it, right? We've been like those jets, drowning out the living world's music, often without having any clue that we did it. No bad faith, no bad will, bad intention, or anything. It was just sort of like, I just love my song, right? And that gets at a second thing. So I first heard this stuff about Bernie Krause's work while I was listening to the TED Radio Hour. And so he gave an interview on this. And the thing that really hit me personally was he said, you know what? The big issue is that humans really fell in love with their own voice, with our own voice. When, in particular, when we created cathedrals, was his hunch. Why? Right? We are singing and we are just enveloped in our human created Promethean beauty. And as someone that loves singing in cathedrals and loves being in a choir, and honestly has had transcendent experiences within cathedrals, our voices are beautiful. I don't want to forget that. I want to hold that. Like there's nothing wrong per se with our Promethean gifts and our beauty, right? That's not a bad, good thing. It's just that if we're out of tune with the Gaian song, right? So the issue is what if we've just so fallen in love with our own song that we've even stopped hearing the larger song we're part of? And I think this is another way of reframing Matt's point, which I just love, and I've come back to quite a bit, Matt Bigger, in that other episode of like, we're better at recognizing our corporate logos than the native plants around us, right? That's indicative of this pattern again, right? So that the pattern basically reveals we build ever more complex Promethean harmonics, and each layer draws us deeper, deeper into those Promethean harmonics and makes it harder and harder for us to hear the Gaian harmonics. And all of those Gaian harmonics, all of the way in which life and ecosystems and physical properties and the properties of Earth, all the stuff we were covering in the earlier episodes around life breathes, islands shape, beings adapt, right? That's the stuff we're ignoring, and at our own peril, right? Hence, when you have emergence in this equation, particularly if as you add in the bigger song of Gaian intelligence that we need to attune to, and Gaian's song, collapse of our current culture basically becomes inevitable. It's logical, it's completely predictable. We're not listening to it. We are just like the jet flying over the toads, and we actually need those toads to live for that jet to exist. That's the issue. So just sit for that for a moment. That's what I'm realizing and thinking about this. Now, with this, I want to start shifting to, okay, then what the heck do we do? How do we think about this? Well, I want to come back to a thread that's been going throughout this whole negotiating reality place, which is the critical importance of indigenous knowledge and indigenous wisdom. In my mind, now with this frame, I think it becomes even more obvious and transparent what was going on, right? My sense is indigenous wisdom traditions and others, particularly those that are really around the kinship worldview, such as that described in Darsha Narvaez's and Wanakabe Topa's or Four Arrows' book, Restoring the Kinship Worldview, right? They are a culture that maybe they always built their Promethean song in attunement with the Gaian song, right? Their anthrophony was always part of the biophony, right? They never lost. They created social reality structures that didn't drown out Mother Earth, but actually helped them to hear it more deeply. What if that's the case, right? That seems to be what like Rob Dunn was getting at with mutualisms, what I think Matt Bigger was getting at with connecting to place. And of course, this is the theme from why I started this whole thing anchoring in the work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, right? It's basically, this stuff is not primitive. This is a cultural blueprint for how to listen in right relationship with Gaia, right? To live in right relationship with life, right? To me, this is the kind of key implication that this sort of cyclical logic, letting go of the linear logic, starts to come into being. And I think it really helps us to get a sense of like, okay, what are we going to do? Well, I think a big part is listen to our indigenous wisdom keepers, right? Listen to those deeper cultural patterns. Understand the culture, those cultural patterns might be literally what's going to save humanity, a critical part of it. So with this, there's one last little key area I want to play with before we get to kind of more of a closing invitation, which is I want to now connect this back to at the end of episode 4, it was really this idea of both cultural evolution and individual development, right? And in particular, I help basically this whole thing, this episode has been much more about the cultural evolution piece. How do we do that, right? But there is also this individual work, which is what I was really talking about with John Kessler, and particularly the integral polarity practice. So the last thing I want to do is I want to use the cyclical or harmonic lens to kind of look again at these and see if there's something deeper we can see. And so in my mind, the path forward is basically attunement, right? Tuning into all of these harmonics, both individually and collectively. So to understand this, like you can think about the cultural calling as basically akin to changing the water. Okay, when I say changing the water, I'm thinking about a very famous commencement speech given by David Foster Wallace. I'll put the link in. You can see it, right? But I'll start with basically the joke that he offers, which is basically two young fish are swimming by an older fish, and the older fish says, "Hey, how's the water, kids?" And the younger fish look at him and say, "What the hell is water?" Right? So that's it, right? The fish don't even know they're in the water. So in this, to continue to play with these metaphors, the water is our anthrophony, right? Particularly our Western anthrophony, right? The Promethean song that is so pervasive and constant and loud and jet fighter-like, right? We're so loud we literally can't hear the toads, right? Now, what does that actually mean like, any more concretely? It's our social reality infrastructure. It's our superpower. It's our concepts. It's our stories. It's the assumptions we tell, right? That's the stuff that shapes what we attend to. And right now, we have culture stuff that basically allows us to fully tune out to Gaia's song. And that's what we need to tune into, right? So we need to change our water. We need to change our cultural reality. We need to be aware that we're swimming in it and to actually be able to shift it. Right? This is where I think, as a really good starting point, Matt Bigger's work and his very simple starting hypothesis of an on-ramp comes into play. Connect to place. Of course, exact same wisdom of indigenous peoples known for generations. We're just stating it again. We're rediscovering it, right? But what does this mean? It really means we need to start letting go of a lot of the ways in which abstractions, the corporations, the other things, these things are just so denatured, acontextual, a-relational, drive so much resources, information, and prestige in our life, and instead try to tether more and more to being in right relationship, tethering to actual living relationships, that mutualism, right? When Rob Dunn talked about it, he's like, I couldn't find mutualisms that didn't actually have close pairing, right? I think that's really profound to note. I think this might be the it, right? And so it's basically learning how to stop being jets, start listening to the synchronized frogs, so to speak. So if that's the cultural work, well then where does John's work come in? Where does this individual work? And where does the idea of individual development come into play? Well, this is where I think it's really starting to learn a slight shift of the word development. I would like to invite the idea of discernment, right? And I want to come back again to a notion of the symphony that Graves offered, but now think about it differently. From an individual perspective, what if it's really just cultivating your capacity to listen with discernment, right? What if that's our individual growth? What if over time you can have this map that John offered of these 21 polarities, and over our lifetimes, we're learning how to discern into all of those polarities and to know how to work with them well, such that in each and every moment we become more and more capable of living into love, grace, or as he likes to say, life, love, and light. That to me is what the integral polarity practice is doing. It is a pathway of cultivating your capacity to attune, particularly to the transcendent. And in so doing, what you're doing is you're basically cultivating your conscience. And you're going to be able to cultivate your conscience, and particularly important when the water, the culture, the harmonics of the culture are not actually leading you well, right? That's where I think John's work becomes so absolutely critical because it's allowing us to be able to separate the bay-old harmonics of our culture and those loud noises with actually getting to be able to hear those quieter parts of the transcendent beauty that I think contemplative traditions have gone for years. And I think John has just created a beautiful map of consciousness with the polarity practice. And ultimately, these are mutually reinforcing as I see it, right? The more individuals that have more capacity to do discernment, the more likely it is that they'll have more capacity to shift our cultural song towards listening to the full bandwidths. Right? And the more the cultural songs shift, the easier it will be for more and more people to be able to hear what matters. So that's what came up for me as I've been thinking about all this. With this, I just want to end with where I began, breath. Breathe in. Oxygen, life, the gift from our brethren plants. Feel it nurture our Promethean fire and our species' superpower. And though, remember then also to breathe out, release, let it go. Our offering of CO2 back to our plant brethren so that we close our cycle with them and we are held as one together. That's the pattern. That's the fractal, right? And at least when we have a healthy ecosystem going, the cultural emergence can come into being, right? So first, the kinship between the dynamic between individual survival and collective belonging. And then the emergence of governance through dynamic leadership and stable institutions. And then if those are working well, we can have the dynamic ship of stewardship through our creative genius and our collective care, right? With this, we're learning how to have our Promethean song in synchrony with Gaian's song, our Mother Earth, our grandmother sun, and beyond. What if the way we think about this is basically we've been holding our breath in, accumulating, growing, expanding, hoarding, grasping, right? We've been only focused on the highest and highest little layers of emergence and completely forgetting that all those little spinnings at the top are 100% reliant upon everything else working on the bottom. So there, the invitation then becomes simple and probably impossibly hard. Let go of the need to keep expanding. As Said said, it's probably time for some degrowth. And maybe the way to start that is just to listen. Learn to understand the harmonics within yourself. Know that a key thing you can do is to learn to discern. Notice the difference between the cultural song and what your conscience knows to be true. Learn how to listen to the biophony, Gaia's song, and know that that's what we want our anthrophony, the Promethean song, to tune into and be in resonance with. So that's what came to me, just as an offering, an idea, a hypothesis, a synthesis delusion binge. Might be crazy. I have no idea. Well, I have some ideas. Honestly, I feel like this is true. I'm trying to show up as honestly and authentically as I can. And it's negotiating reality, right? I would love to hear thoughts, reactions. Was this making sense? Was this not? So that we can grow and learn together and continue this evolution together. With that, thank you very much. And I hope you have a wonderful day.